Ambassador, and I really appreciate how you emphasize that there are struggles within Cuba, but what propaganda does is obscure the reality of what produced that struggle.
Exactly.
So I have been on liberated territory in Cuba myself, and I have seen it with my own eyes. And what I saw was there was an energy crisis. There is a shortage of oil. Why?
Exactly.
Because there is the most brutal, criminal U.S. blockade on Cuba, preventing Cuba from reaching energy sovereignty. What I always like to say to folks in the United States is that Cuba, for example, has developed a lung vaccine and has developed their own COVID vaccine, but because of the blockade, cannot get enough medical equipment necessary to administer that en masse. And that really exemplifies the cruelty of the blockade. It is not that the Cuban people are not brilliant and competent. It is not that the government is not concerned and occupied with serving the needs of the people. It's that the United States does not allow the Cuban government and the Cuban people to execute their socialist project in full.
Exactly.
So, can you share a little bit about the statistics, the quantifiable impacts on an annual basis of the U.S. blockade on the Cuban economy?
Exactly. For example, if I have just 1 minute to describe U.S. policy towards Cuba, right now I would say that on one hand is the mindset is to suffocate the Cuban economy, to prevent income and provoke scarcity with purpose of destabilization and domination. And at the same time is to finance a multi-million communication operation to blame the victim of the impact of U.S. measures. In terms of figures, for example, in 1 year, between 2023 and 2024, the combined set of sanctions and unilateral coercive measures of the United States against the Cuban people produced that Cuba lose $7,556 millions of dollars. That will imply, if Cuba wasn't robbed that income, it had implied that the Cuban GDP will grow 9% if tariff going backward. Mm-hmm. That's one of statistics. For example, with 1.6 thousand millions of those 7,000 millions, the electroenergetic system in Cuba will be completely refurbished. Just one more example. In 2015, Cuba had an investment in one of the main electric factories in Cuba, energy factory, Antonio Guiterres, an investment from France, from a company called Aston. Few months later, that we signed that agreement, a U.S. company bought that French company, and immediately we start getting trouble in the spare parts, in the fulfillment of the contract, that if the engineer piece will be broken, they will come and fix it, or a technician will come. So it's another way to prove. Right now, just 2 months ago, we needed a spare part for a company. The country was in Asia, and the technician couldn't come because they were afraid of the punishment, because today United States is enforcing to Cuba the most sophisticated system of unilateral sanction that existed on earth. Imagine a country that now is trembling because of a tariff of 26%. What Cuba has is much more comprehensive. No one will resist that pressure. And we are resisting, and we are advancing, and we are innovating in the middle of that situation. But as you mentioned, it is very cruel, because the priority of no country should be to deprive a closed nation, a neighboring country that doesn't have one single measure of aggression against your country, to wreak havoc in the economy, to suffocate the population.
And I'm so grateful that you mentioned tariffs, because we can see in contemporary politics under the second Trump administration, for example, Brazil, where I have dual citizenship, we have an independent judiciary system where our previous president, Bolsonaro, was indicted on charges of sparking and enabling and embedding a coup, right?
Exactly.
And that happened in the United States as well.
The lawfare.
Right. And we see that Trump and the United States government is attempting to interfere in a sovereign nation's judicial process through implementing tariffs, and an attempt to coerce the Brazilian sovereign government into complying with Trump's agenda. And I think there's a direct parallel between the way that they attempt to intimidate all of our countries in Latin America and Cuba, right, through economic warfare. And it is so important to draw those connections, because the more that we fortify our economic relationships between our countries, the more we can weaken the U.S. petrodollar and U.S. economic hegemony. On that note, can you speak to the hope and the potential that economic configurations between countries in the global south, such as BRICS, for example, which is, been largely spearheaded by Brazil, what opportunity does that present Cubans?
We've been accepted as partner of BRICS, not a member like Brazil, but a partner, and we recognize that a window is open there for us to present our projects in biotechnology, in agriculture, in different areas, when Cuba, as you mentioned before, has built up scientific capacity, and that we can find mutual and rewarding complementary gain by working with other countries. So we are very stimulated in those different agencies in Cuba are working in projects in order, as you mentioned, to circumvent the medieval siege that the United States is building around the Cuban people. And I'm sure that we shall overcome, that we will be able not just to survive, but with a lot of creativity to again obtain new victories for our people that deserve it so much, because there's a tremendous history of putting together all the efforts of an entire population for the commonwealth of everybody, and not just for a few, and the results that unite us in our resistance.
That's beautiful, Ambassador. I think that the resilience, the brilliance, and the creativity of the Cuban people over so many decades in the face of such a brutal economic blockade have showed us what is possible for humanity and what is possible for resistance. My last final question for you is, what can we learn as activists, organizers, scholars, educators, frontline workers in the United States who want to advance the project of socialism, human dignity? What can we learn from the Cuban people, and how can we support the Cuban Revolution?
I think the countries should learn and trust themselves in not accepting as a dogma the narrative of self-defeat that the imperialism would like to impose in their own people and in our population, in order to counteract any real capacity of the people to look for and fight for a better world. A better world is possible. Cuba already demonstrated at a very high price, but that I think that willingness and that capacity to continue working for what is good for us and not accepting defeat as a destiny, but writing our own destiny. I think that is something that Cuba could share with the world, and we are learning also from other countries. I would like to take this opportunity also to thank you, to thank your public and the people that has been digging and looking for through and not accepting the official narrative of the State Department that is lying every single day. Now they are saying that Cubans are recruiting people to go and fight in Ukraine. This is not true. Cuba has legislation against mercenarism. U.S., by the way, doesn't.
Yes.
U.S. is hire mercenary people to go into any conflict when they don't want to go themselves, not us.
Yes.
So this is another example of so many.
Yes.
Because again, they have to lie to their own population to justify their criminal behavior.
Yes.
And one other thing I would say, if you don't trust me, come to Cuba. There are still legal ways to visit Cuba in some of the legal categories that at least still are allowed. And don't trust me, don't trust yourself, come and see with your own eyes, and you will find no enemy in our humble, happy, and very hospitalious country.
Absolutely. It is not the will of the American people to pursue this blockade. It is a tool of the imperialist, colonialist government of the United States that we are actively resisting and suffering from as well. So the Cubans have the humility, the love, and the intellect to understand that people do not equate their violent governments. And so come visit Cuba for yourself, see the truth, and the younger generation is certainly discovering all of the beauty that is the Cuban Revolution, and our duty and responsibility as citizens of the United States to Cuba, to Latin America, to Palestine, and the rest of the world that has been pillaged and robbed by our country against our will.
This is very important. This is very important because this narrative has a purpose, and is to take our two countries, United States and Cuba, into a scenarios of artificially, or to take us artificially to real scenarios of confrontation. That is the dream of Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, of the congressional delegation of Florida, that is making a piñata out of the fraud of presenting Cuba as the country that we are not, and that are even betraying the Cuban immigration after forcing them to immigrate to the United States, but imposing horrible sanctions that make their life very difficult. So I will invite both Americans and Cuba to fight together and to come to Cuba and to work for better relations between our two countries that deserve each other. There is not a single survey into the American population that will give you other results that the majority of the people of the United States are not believing that the embargo should continue, that the blockade should continue. Most of them would like normal relations with Cuba.
Beautiful. Muchas gracias, Ambassador. Cuba sí bloqueo, no.
Sí, gracias, muchas gracias.